Of today's Farm Report, Dan Martins with the University of Minnesota Extension Service Office continues his discussion of crop trials going on by the University of Minnesota Extension Service in southern Minnesota and how the differences between early and late maturity corn is coming out.
We sometimes think that later maturing crops have more yield potential than early maturing crops. I shared an observation recently from Extension corn agronomist Jeff Coulter saying that there can be more variability in grain yield among hybrids within a given relative maturity group than there is between maturity groups. Here's a little bit of what we see in looking at the U of M variety trials at central Minnesota locations in 2015. Central locations are noted at Hutchinson, Morris, and Rosemont. I think about Rosemont soil as being a little bit on the sandy side, Hutchinson soil being a little on the heavier side, and Morris being a little bit more in the middle. Across all three sites, varieties listed as early maturing, with relative maturities from 90 to 96 days, average 207 bushels per acre, with a range from 177 to 225, and a least statistical difference of 13 bushels per acre. The lowest variety at any of the three sites measured 144, and the highest 256. The varieties that were listed as late maturing with relative maturities from 98 to 105 averaged 215 bushels per acre with a range from 191 to 257, with a least statistical difference of 14 bushels per acre. The lowest yield at an individual site among the late maturing groups was 126 and the high was 277. I could look at that and say later varieties averaging 215 compared to early varieties averaging 207 might give later varieties a little bit of an edge. But there is more difference among varieties within a maturity group than between maturity ranges, from 177 to 225 for the early group and from 191 to 257 for the late group. It's also interesting to note that the highest average yield for a variety at Hutchinson was 240 bushels per acre, and one of these varieties was in the early group at 95 days, and one was in the late group at 102 days. At Morris, the highest variety was in the late group at 103 days with a yield of 269, and the highest early variety was 90 days at 238 bushels. In Rosemont, the highest yield was in the late group at 103 days and 257 bushels, and the high in the early group, 95 days at 256 bushels. I wonder if it was a little wet or dry at Hutchinson and Morris at some point that contributed to higher yields at Rosemont. Well, that's a lot of numbers and probably a little difficult to track over the radio. The discussion about yield compared to maturity could get more relevant if we find measurable benefits from cover crops, where getting the corn crop off earlier allows more time for a cover crop to develop following harvest without giving up too much yield. The prospects of this could vary with soil types and other production practices. I'm Dan Martins with University of Minnesota Extension.
Thinking about soil health, cover crops, reduced tillage, minimizing the use of herbicides and insecticides are all topics we likely hear and read about when working on the farm and trying to minimize the impact to the environment. But, as Dan Martins with the University of Minnesota Extension Service Office explains, there are other things that impact our local habitats, and it may be thousands of miles away.
Had a good visit with a thoughtful farmer recently about soil health, cover crops, reduced tillage, minimizing use of herbicides and insecticides, topics we're likely to hear and read a lot about through the winter meeting season. This brings to mind a few notes from a discussion offered by Extension Pest Management Specialist Bruce Potter at a Certified Crop Advisors workshop held in Paynesville last September. If you've heard or worked with Bruce, you know he takes a pretty practical approach to things. He doesn't mind stepping out of the box to take a different look at something. He's been around long enough to remember things we've learned in the past that might be useful to consider as we think about something thought to be new now. I shared a couple observations from Bruce back in October. Here are a couple of more. As a pest management specialist, Bruce gets in on discussions about damage to non-target species like monarch butterflies. Bruce would readily agree that we should learn everything we can to protect beneficial insects while working to manage insects that cause significant damage to agriculture and horticulture crops. Bruce makes a pretty strong case for making spray decisions for pests like soybean aphids and potato leafhoppers based on research-based thresholds and against the practice of routine spraying just to be sure without carefully evaluating thresholds. Bruce also makes a point that we should be aware of other forces in nature and the world around us that can cause significant problems for beneficial insects as well. He shared, for example, a serious freeze on January 11, 2002 in Mexico that killed a large portion of the monarch butterfly population that spends the winter there. 60 to 70% of the monarch population overwinter in 2 mountain areas. On one of these, it was estimated that 74% of the monarchs were lost. On the other, it was 81%. In 1982, it was estimated that about 70% of wintering monarchs in Mexico froze to death as a result of 3 days of rain and sub-freezing conditions. Bruce mentioned that deforestation in that area was also a concern, and that the widespread drought in the Midwest of the U.S. was tough on monarch populations in that area. So along with being smart about what we're doing, we should be aware of other factors that impact the population cycles of critters around us. Letting milkweed grow where it's not causing a significant problem seems like a sensible thing to do. I'd have to say I was amazed at the number of monarch butterflies I saw while taking a look at some small grain and hay fields with a farmer last summer in the middle of August. Bruce also mentioned the importance of learning about alternative crops in terms of pest management and where and how they might fit into other crop rotations. He shared the example that pennycress is an alternative host for soybean cyst nematode. Historically, we think about pennycress as a weed. Now it's being studied as a potential oilseed crop. That might turn out well, but it certainly makes sense to give some careful thought to how it fits with managing soybean cyst nematode. I'm Dan Martins with U of M Extension. Thanks for the thoughtful care you give to things you're doing around your home and farm and workplace.
Mexico and Canada had asked the World Trade Organization for authority to impose retaliatory tariffs against the U.S. because of the U.S. country of origin labeling law. They had asked for $3 billion in penalties. What they got was $1 billion.
The WTO decision affirms the fact that, indeed, they were overstating their damages.
But Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack told us $1 billion is still a lot, especially now that U.S. ag exports are already declining because of strong competition and the strong dollar. The only way to head off the penalties is for lawmakers to do something with the country of origin law. The Senate has yet to act on it. The House already voted to just repeal the whole thing. Vilsack said doing that would be overkill. Instead,
they can focus on the provisions of COOL that actually created the retaliation without necessarily eliminating all aspects of COOL, some of which people actually like and are benefiting producers without necessarily violating WTO rules and regulations.
He said he hopes they leave the option of a voluntary label open, but whatever they do, he says they need to do it quickly. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.